Wonderful. I think we have quite a few folks on now, so let's get started. I'm Prab Gill. I'm an associate partner based out of Vancouver, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'll be joined by my colleagues Scott and Tom, who will be leading us through the discussion. And as we go along, please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. So I can kick us off and introduce myself. So as I mentioned, I'm an associate partner based out of Vancouver. I do most of my work in McKinsey's retail operations practice, and I focus primarily on omni-channel supply chain and tech enablement. Tom, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Prab. And thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Tom Bartman. I am also an associate partner with McKinsey. I'm based in our Miami office, and I do all of my work in our transportation and logistics practice, where I serve players in the supply chain that support e-commerce from end to end, from the ocean shipping inbound all the way to parcel and final mile and each step in between. We're excited to have you joining us today. We have a pretty exciting agenda to go through, where we'll start by outlining the growth in e-commerce and the opportunity that it provides to logistics companies. Then we'll share a bit of our perspective on the recent trends and opportunities that we're seeing in the marketplace. And then finally, we have some time for questions at the end. We'd love to hear what's top of mind for you. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Prab. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. My name is Scott McConnell. I'm a partner with McKinsey based out of Chicago. I've spent my time at McKinsey virtually entirely serving transportation and logistics clients, including rail, airline, trucking companies, last mile distribution, up and down the value chain. It's been a thrilling last few years in the space, to say the least, with the growth of e-commerce. And as Tom said, let's jump right in. Would love to share a little bit of our views of what we're seeing, as well as really spend time to discuss what we're seeing as value drivers in the space, and then hear from you. So as we've all experienced over the last year, COVID has accelerated what was already a very high growth rate for e-commerce volumes across regions. In the initial months of COVID, after wages stabilized, consumer spending continued to grow, but with a strong shift of mix towards spending on goods versus services. And that spike created a real new baseline for growth in e-commerce. And we've seen that growth continue at the same or higher rate as what we saw pre-COVID. Cumulatively speaking, we'd expect volumes to be roughly double what they were pre-COVID by 2025. And then moving to the next slide, a driver of this has been the shift into categories that had previously had very low online penetration. So on top of the steep growth of categories that we see on the left, like consumer goods, household goods, that were already e-commerce mainstays, categories like grocery, furniture have grown exceptionally fast, with many consumers signaling that they're going to continue buying these categories through these channels as their new normal. On top of this driving significantly higher volumes in aggregate, these categories are also creating a lot more complexity in the supply chain due to their unique requirements, whether it be cold chain, big and bulky, high incidence of returns, or white glove delivery service. Each of these bringing new complexities and nuances to an already difficult supply chain. And then lastly, layering in consumer expectations around speed and service, which continue to climb. The average delivery time for an online order dropped over 50% from 2014 up to the point of COVID. And it's going forward, expectations are consumers are squarely focused on same day instant delivery. And that just leaves a massive pressure on logistics providers to deliver quickly and efficiently, even more so than they do today. And the context here that I've shared in the last few slides, it's largely been driven by B2C e-commerce, but it would be amiss to not spend a moment and talk about B2B e-commerce, which in itself is a massive market, nearly 6 times the size of B2C globally, and showing the same growth trends as B2C. Consumers, what's happening is consumers are bringing their same expectations they have at home to the workplace around speed, reliability, and experience. 94% of B2B buyers do their research online and have a strong preference for suppliers that offer a seamless online experience. And so this trend is bearing out in the data. where B2B e-commerce has grown at over 12% over the last 5 years leading up to COVID, compared to just 3.5% for offline sales. And although B2B volumes took a bit more of a hit in COVID compared to B2C, we're seeing the rates recover and expect e-commerce growth in B2B to continue, with the fastest growth coming in durable categories like industrial and automotive goods. So against that context, in the next slide, we want to use this session to explore the impact of this growth in e-commerce on a cost-efficient logistics operation. We're going to talk about a few things in particular: fulfillment, last mile, and returns. But before we jump into that, just to level set a bit of how we look at the logistics operation ecosystem. So when we talk about the e-commerce logistics ecosystem, we think about it and talk about it as a string of pearls. It's only beautiful if nothing breaks. It's a very tightly knit operation that connects the consumer, the seller, and oftentimes a variety of physical and digital players that sit in between and need to do so with great efficiency and reliability. So on the next slide, we lay this string of pearls out a bit, and it shows a customer experience that operates really at the intersection of digital and physical flows, where a digital shopping experience launches a well-orchestrated set of physical operations to deliver on time, as well as to offer increasingly real-time visibility and options for either redirecting shipments or returns. Succeeding in this space requires a high amount of integration of offerings across both the top half of this chart, which more highlights the digital flows, as well as the bottom half, which covers the physical flows. And for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to focus more on the trends and opportunities on the bottom half, the physical flows of e-commerce. And so to frame this discussion, it's necessary for us to introduce cost as a constraint. So everything we've discussed now, growth, speed, reliability, visibility, these are all complexity-inducing trends that we've discussed. And however, consumers are becoming less willing to pay for any of those complexity-inducing qualities of a shipment. And so this puts logistics providers in a pinch point where they're balancing cost and quality, defining quality as speed, reliability, and visibility. Looking at this illustrative retail P&L breakdown, logistics cost is about 12 to 20 cents on the dollar for an e-commerce shipment, which is compared to about 6 to 8 cents for brick and mortar. And this is already a very margin-thin business, so managing that logistics cost becomes very important. And then looking at this over time, as it's continued to grow, the logistics cost has continued to grow even as volumes grow. And so what we're seeing is that e-commerce logistics brings a diseconomies of scale due to a few things. One being an increase of the products mix, meaning that there's more items, more complex items that need to be stored. And faster speeds means that distribution centers, there need to be more of them, but also in more populated and expensive locations. And also more visibility means that more technology and investment is required to meet those growing customer needs. So winners in this space need to find new and innovative ways to meet those needs and do so at lower cost. I'd love to bring my colleague Prab in here a bit, who spends a lot of time serving shippers and companies in that space and can bring that voice of the shipping customer. Prab?
Thanks, Scott. So just to add to what Scott mentioned, from the retailer lens, I think with respect to cost trends, there's probably two key areas that are top of mind for retailers. The first is related to last mile, and that's where retailers have really seen costs rising, just given increasing demand and then more limited capacity of some of their gig economy partners in response to that. So really looking at diversification within that space for example, multiple last mile partners. The second key area that we've seen retailers talk about is on the fulfillment side. So also seeing cost pressures there as wages are increasing and as they're looking towards other solutions. So for example, more automated solutions and other areas include, for example, reducing split shipments. And those span across both the last mile and the fulfillment side. So I think key factor for retailers now is diversification, really. So like I mentioned, the multiple last mile partners and also having flex capacity from that standpoint, and using a mix of manual MFC, CFCs for picking and packing on the fulfillment side.
Thanks, Prob. With that, let's talk a bit about fulfillment. So this is, a core activity of the e-commerce supply chain, and one that contract logistics providers are most intimately familiar with. When we look at this, the first thing that we like to say is how big is this market and what's driving the growth over time. And so what you'll see here on the left side of this page is a projection from 2020 to 2025 of the global contract logistics market size. And what we see from this is that even as we include the COVID spike that occurred in 2020 into our baseline, the online warehousing market is expected to grow at about 7 times as fast as the offline market and about 3 times as fast as the overall. So e-commerce and omni-channel related warehousing is a large and increasingly important part of the contract logistics market. What's driving this increase in growth is both the demand that Scott described earlier, but also just the level of activity required to do this successfully. So we know that these orders are causing more touches per item than traditional bulk delivery. If you think about a flow to a brick and mortar retailer, that leads to, about 2 to 3 items versus a case or a pallet level flow through warehouses, which then requires a lot more activity on a per unit basis, both from the picking, but also from preparing the item to go out through a parcel channel versus a roll cage. Increasingly, we're seeing contract logistics providers adding value-added services like kitting or light assembly at the point of fulfillment that allows them to both differentiate their offering relative to their competitors, but also increase margins by having that higher value service provided in the service flow. Interestingly, as we look at the landscape of providers of e-commerce fulfillment, we're seeing a move to the middle. And so the way that we've structured this market traditionally is looking at the core capabilities that a player brings. So are they traditionally digital, physical, or a hybrid of both? And then where do they position themselves in the market as as either a logistics backend platform, as a market platform that does the front end of the web shop, or as someone trying to do it all? And what we've seen, led particularly by some of the marketplace giants who were the first movers in this space back in the middle of the last decade, is an increasing shift to the middle, where folks that have traditionally done the front end are adding back end logistics capabilities, either through an owned model or more often in partnership with specialist logistic providers. And at the same time, the folks that have done more of the traditional physical flow back-end logistics are increasingly moving up the value chain by adding digital components, both in the middle layer, when you think about order allocation or payment processing, and then all the way even to the front where they're actually operating some web shops in some cases. And so we expect this trend to continue over time as these players converge in the center to offer one-stop shops, particularly for sellers that are less sophisticated, and knowing how much of the e-commerce volume is driven by that long tail. That's certainly a growth market for contract logistics. When we think about what do folks value when they're looking for a fulfillment provider, there are 6 capabilities that rise above all the others. And the most important that we've seen is really proven capabilities. Folks that are hiring a logistics provider are truly making, in some ways, a bet the career decision on who they choose to hire for that, as one missed season at holiday or at peak could really prove to be quite costly for an organization. And so looking for an organization that has a credible and observable capability that you can walk through, you can see in a showcase or a lighthouse, is really a big differentiator that initially surprised me, but makes sense as you start to think about it on those dimensions. Certainly network density and cost enable you to balance the service level and speed with cost equation. And so we see those as quite related, with the sense that network density allows you to get closer but it also has its own challenges when it comes to inventory fragmentation that needs to be managed. And so, as you think about creating an offering that is both dense and gets people close to their market, you also need to have a commensurate capability to help them with demand planning and inventory positioning to make sure that it's the right position for the optimal good and it's not just duplicating inventory holding cost, which offsets that cheaper last mile expense. And then two other areas that were particularly interesting that they rose here is the ability to manage seasonality. As we've talked to folks that are procuring contract logistics work, um, the need to have an operation that can scale to peak demands is certainly paramount, but it's also a function of making sure that you don't lose either the quality or the efficiency associated with that. So it's beyond just brute force or throwing additional resources at the problem. It's about having an operating model that truly can scale to manage that higher volume that you're going to see in those peak periods. And then lastly, onboarding speed and experience. This is an incredibly complex system, as Scott showed with a string of pearls. And so for those folks that are selling online, having a provider that's able to onboard them quickly at low or no upfront cost is extremely important, particularly as you think about the shift from EDI to API feeds with digital native sellers. And that's an area that we see logistics providers continuing to improve and to add more capability on. So when we put all that together, there are 5 approaches that we see as really coming to offer distinctive services in e-commerce fulfillment. The first is a multi-tenant structure. So traditionally, contract logistics is a one-off customized solution. Increasingly, we're seeing value and the opportunity for value from adopting more of a multi-tenant structure where you can imagine that inventory and goods are commingled, particularly if you're using a goods to man type model that enables you to position each good optimally in the flow so that you're not then having inefficiency as people walk to multiple pick faces organized by different customers. This allows you to get closer to the consumer for your customers while enabling them to reap the benefits of having only as much space inside of a box as they need. Related to that is contract structures. So increasingly, e-commerce is relying on automation that has payback periods that are as long or perhaps even longer than the average length of a contract logistics agreement. And so what that requires of the logistics operator is the ability to structure their agreement in such a way that that CapEx can generate an ROI, or there's protection for both parties, the shipper and the contract logistics provider, for what happens if the contract ends before that equipment has been fully depreciated. Related to that is automation, and Prob started to talk about this too. We're seeing more and more folks adopting automation, both as wages increase and the pure math of the ROI becomes more attractive, but also as a way to improve service, particularly in the current environment with COVID. And you think about the challenges of operating warehouses where you need social distancing, or you have to isolate folks if there's been any kind of an exposure, or even just higher attrition that I know many of my clients are struggling with right now. Automation allows you to keep your operation running more smoothly. The flexible API-based technology, this comes back to the speed of onboarding. And it really is about both the traditional kind of connection to the warehouse and the ERP with the WMS, but it's also about flexibility in the order management system and what the contract logistics provider chooses to control in the order management system versus what they are taking orders from their customers on. And this is going to vary based on the size of the customer that you're working with. So, for example, a small retailer that may have only a few shops and primarily serves e-commerce, they want to outsource the order management fully to their logistics provider so that they don't need to think about or worry with where's the order going to route to. Conversely, a well-established large organization that might have numerous retail locations will likely want to retain control over that because they'll need to be able to see whether the order should be routed to a store for a fulfill from store or to the logistics provider who's doing the classic e-commerce fulfillment. And then finally, relationships with the carriers in today's tight trucking capacity and parcel capacity market, having more ability to move things at lower costs is a unique differentiator. And for the near term future, that's likely to persist as the shortages of labor, are expected to continue from what we can see today. So happy to take questions, and I see a few coming in through the Q&A as we get to this at the back, but also want to continue our conversation with final mile. And I know this is an area that is really top of mind to the shippers, the retailers and e-tailers, and also to the logistics industry as we've seen an increased reliance on the final mile over the past year with people shopping online, during COVID and the isolation that we've been doing. Not surprisingly, that has translated to quite a bit of growth in the parcel market. So this is North America. This is number of parcels in billions. And you can see the jump that we had in 2020, right about the middle of that chart, where we added 2.5 billion parcels as folks shopped online. That led to an extreme surge in growth. We saw about 14% CAGR from 15 to 20 and the B2C side, while B2B was actually a slight decline, not surprising given that folks ordered less things through parcel in 2020. But that being said, we expect this to continue through 2025 as the consumer deliveries continue to outpace the business deliveries and the overall volume strains networks that are already at tight capacity. The big challenge that this poses for these providers of parcel services is that margins on residential deliveries are often a quarter to half those of commercial deliveries. So as this mix shifts over time to being increasingly consumer, that value equation needs to be offset. One of the solutions that we see folks using is price increases and surcharges to bring that margin more close to the commercial margin for the consumer deliveries. Increasingly, though, as we're seeing volumes grow, people are also becoming more cognizant of the impact that the final mile has on our society and particularly on our planet. And so what you can see here is a vast plurality is looking for increased sustainability in the final mile. That includes everything around recyclable packaging to carbon neutral delivery. And in fact, increasing use of alternative methods of home delivery that perhaps don't rely on the specific, each flow of items that are moved on a carbon intensive platform. We expect that over time, this is going to continue to become a increasing focal point, particularly for younger consumers that shop with their conscience and that look for brands and service providers that are going to fulfill what they believe is a social obligation in addition to a commercial obligation. This could have pretty significant impacts on parcel operations. For example, carbon neutral delivery, the transition to electric fleets requires a pretty substantial change to the way that the final delivery hubs operate, where everything in their infrastructure has been geared around a diesel or a gasoline-based fleet, having to shift to an electric-based fleet where you may need to do quite extensive modifications to the power and even up to the power grid and provider delivering into the building. Similarly, consolidation of packages on the bottom left. While that can be very helpful for parcel providers because it enables them to increase the density of their consumer packages, it also requires, in many cases, retooling the sortation flow that happens upstream of that final mile. So opportunities and challenges that we believe the industry is going to have to grapple with over the coming years. What we see folks doing to be successful in this space, five strategies. The first is probably pretty obvious, but to the extent that you're able to shift your focus and your capacity allocation to more lucrative segments in a capacity constrained environment, that is going to be margin accretive to the business, and that's going to enable a parcel provider to get the most out of their network and out of their physical assets. The sustainable technologies, we talked a bit about this, but really thinking about what sustainability means across many dimensions of the business. And it is both the equipment that you have, as well as how you operate and you run your processes. Consolidation of delivery networks. We see a massive opportunity for advanced analytical tools to continue to drive efficiency in the parcel space. While a lot of folks are using them for things like routing in the final mile, there's increasing opportunities to deploy advanced analytics further up the chain, and using it to do things like, for example, planning out the labor and staffing levels at sortation hubs, determining what the optimal mode is for a package to flow on based on probabilistic modeling of how other parts of the network are going to operate. All of these are emerging opportunities to drive more efficiency in the business. Moving along the value chain, we're seeing a number of players do this where they're looking to add, more control, particularly upstream. And so getting into the fulfillment space where, as a parcel player, having control over fulfillment allows for optimization of more steps in the chain. So you can actually choose where to pick, pack, and ship an item from in the fulfillment network such that it complements the delivery network, and you avoid, for example, overstressing one lane while having another lane be idle. And then finally, driving down costs through innovative production delivery modes. This is the basic blocking and tackling of really taking a clean sheet view to your operation and assessing what could be done if we think about this from a greenfield solution to drive more efficiency in our operation. So that's what we're seeing happening in the fulfillment and the final mile space. I'd now like Scott to join us and talk through a bit of the returns logistics space.
Thanks, Tom. So finally, today we'll discuss returns in reverse logistics. So as we go to the next slide, returns are a fact of life in e-commerce. Not only are returns more likely in e-commerce, but the magnitude of that difference continues to grow. So what was 25% in e-commerce in this blue chart on the left a few years ago is generally considered well over 30% today, with some categories like apparel much higher in terms of a return rate. And then similar to speed, consumer expectations around fast and easy returns are rising with no turning back. And as we go to the next page, we see what that impact is on retail economics. So for example, we took a retailer with illustratively a 14% margin and assumed a 10% return rate, which is quite conservative given the figures we discussed on the prior slide. And when accounting for the cost of returns and some amount of residual value from the return goods, the profit margin can quickly drop to 2 to 4% for this retailer. So what do they do with this? These retailers pursuing opportunities across two axes. One is how to make the returns process more efficient, and two is about how to maximize the residual value they can get out of the returned goods. So the next slide explores the former opportunity a bit further. Now, there are multiple drivers of complexity that retailers and 3PLs alike wrestle with that are significantly more complex in reverse than forward logistics. For starters, there's an additional occurrence of the last mile transportation leg, and that's to inject the shipment back into the value chain. And then once it's received, the product needs to be inspected, verified, potentially tested, or even repaired for quality. There's a decision that has to be made about disposition, and that oftentimes requires someone with some level of skill to deliver that, to make that subjective decision, and then ultimately complete the logistics for resale or disposal. So each of these new steps requires some level of talent that's higher than baseline warehouse workers in forward logistics. And so it introduces cost. However, it does create an opportunity for retailers who are ahead of this nascent curve to extract value from reverse logistics. On the next slide, we have examples of what a few of our clients are doing as they follow three core principles to create value from returns. First is to make returns a core offering of their business. So what we mean by that is returns should be thought of as its own product or a journey similar to the rest of the customer experience, where our client is organizing around it, putting a team with leaders against it, and they are designing the service and the quality of the return experience that customers seek. And then with that focus team in place, they're then building the network to match that design service. So that means products are segmented and handled based on the activities required to triage, repair, and resell that category. And then those segments move through a network designed for them in a different way that minimizes touches and ensures that the right talent is centralized to make those subjective decisions about triage and disposition. And then finally, automating and optimizing the returns process as far forward in the value chain as possible. And this is expanding in cases to even mean product redesign is being considered to facilitate fast and effective returns. For example, adding components or self-testing components to electric goods so that when they're returned, they can quickly be triaged to see if they're ready for resale or if they've been excessively used. At the end of the day, returns have the potential to be a growing and massive cost driver for retailers, and it's increasingly being carefully managed. But there remains an opportunity for retailers and their logistics partners alike to dramatically change the economics from a couple slides ago to both create value, but also a great experience for their customers. And with that, we reached the end of our prepared material. And again, we wanted to save time for Q&A. So we've had a few questions come in. I'll let Prab moderate the Q&A and we'll get the discussion started. So feel free to enter any further questions you have using the Q&A button at the bottom.
Great, thank you, Scott. I'll just answer a couple of the more tactical questions up front, and then Scott, I'll pass it back to you. First one was asking about whether or not the slides will be shared after the presentation. And yes, we will be sending out a PDF of the document. Second question was around whether or not you will have access to this recording, and we will be uploading to YouTube. It'll take a few days, but we will give you access to that as well. First question for you, Scott. Do you think Amazon will start picking up their own returns and potentially picking up other retailers' returns?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's a great question, and I mean, I'd preface it by saying it's impossible to say with any sort of authority or confidence what precisely Amazon's going to do next. But it can point to a couple trends that we're seeing in the return space and what we're seeing Amazon has already done. One is actively beginning to build returns as an experience, right? If you've returned something in the last year compared to what it was 4 or 5 years ago on Amazon, it's self-guided, payment received in many cases almost immediately, whether as a credit or back to your account, which is one of the largest drivers of consumer satisfaction and returns, was getting paid back very quickly. And also pooling those returns at injection points in the network that are easy to get to. So to minimize that incidence of a last mile transportation leg. So a lot of retail partnerships have sprung up for Amazon, FedEx, UPS. A lot of players have done this as well. So there's no doubt there's a move to make returns a more seamless experience. I do think there's an opportunity for, I'll use the word, an aggregator like an Amazon or another large player to pick up other retailers' returns as well. And it's you could simply point to the economic success of what Fulfilled by Amazon has been to their business in terms of adding to their profit margin by just delivering their scale to smaller customers and retailers that don't have the capacity or frankly the economics themselves to support a robust and great experience for returns for their customers.
Great, thank you, Scott. Tom, I'll direct the next question to you. Can you speak to trends in optimization in VAS, kitting, and space planning?
Yeah, thanks, Prab. I think this is a really interesting space as you think about how e-commerce is reshaping the way that we consume things. So VAS would be value-added services, and typically, what we're seeing in value-added services in the e-commerce space is a increasing bar where previously it had been sufficient to offer some degree of gift receipt, for example, or light gift wrapping. Increasingly now we're seeing even more ability to do packaging, particularly around assembly of light items. So if you have multiple things that come into a kit, having those stored in the optimal way, and then at the last moment, the contract logistics provider will actually assemble them into their kit and will package them and ship them out. There's also an interesting space here around how folks are consuming, different categories of things. So, for example, the meal kit space, where you're actually doing the sub assembly of the items in a fulfillment center and shipping them out in a continuous flow process. We're seeing more and more of that happen as folks shift consumption of things like groceries online. And then increasingly in the value added services, as Scott said, the reverse logistics. And so being able to incorporate the flow of returns back into a fulfillment center where you're doing the triaging, the disposition, putting things into new packaging to go back onto shelves and quickly re-enter the forward supply chain. All of these are spaces that we would expect to see more and more growth in the e-commerce side. And then when you think about the omni-channel side, which we've mostly now been talking about digital flows through a parcel channel, but if you think about digital purchases going into a physical store, there could even be kitting opportunities around creating things like gift packs or other items that will go onto shelves and are ordered and picked up that way.
Great, thank you, Tom. The next question that came in was, how do you see the role of stores in omni-channel distribution going forward? I can take that question. So what we've seen from a retailer perspective is actually that now they're thinking more so about their networks more holistically. They're not just fulfilling e-commerce orders from distribution centers or hubs, but looking at their holistic footprint across stores, DCs, fulfillment hubs, and then thinking through where it makes most sense to both deliver on cost expectations as well as service levels for customers. So it's a bit of a balancing act between getting orders to the end consumer in a very timely fashion and also saving on costs of fulfillment from stores versus DCs, and also the last mile once you incorporate that into your overall cost equation. Tom, the next question I'll direct to you. Do you see innovative players such as Shipmunk, ShipBob as credible disruptors of the fulfillment industry?
Thanks, Prob. I won't speak to any one company directly, but I think as you look at the landscape of emerging providers of contract logistics, particularly in e-commerce, I do think there are quite innovative models that are being formed out there. And the way that this feels like it has the potential to grow into something that could be a bit more disruptive is that a lot of these emerging players are serving very small shippers. And these are folks who are operating things like Etsy shops, and they might even be just one individual with a small business. And so they're starting with those folks who typically need quite simple solutions that are easy to integrate and have relatively low levels of sophistication or demand on what they provide in actual physical flow. So it might be slower from click to fulfillment. It might be a little more expensive. It might not be as fast click to door, but it's simple and it's easy for those folks to integrate with. Now, what's interesting to watch over the next few years is going to be, will there be companies that start in that small, nascent, low kind of sophistication that hit it big and see significant rapid growth? And if those folks are able to grow with those companies that you'll find that their solution has really struck a chord, I could imagine that they'll be building their capabilities quite rapidly alongside those few champion e-tailers that they support, that could start to create a compelling offering even for your more traditional enterprise customers over time.
Great, thank you, Tom. Scott, the next question I'll direct to you. What do you think about quick commerce? Will consumer expectations of on-demand delivery for groceries and convenience influence the e-commerce fulfillment space?
Yeah, thanks, Prob. And actually, I'll combine that. There was another question that came in around, do you see the uncertainty on gig economy workers regulation as a potential limiting factor for the growth of last mile delivery or a bit? So I'll take both in turn. And the answer on its face is absolutely. Consumer expectations as it relates to instant delivery of grocery convenience and frankly, just about any type of good is going to shape e-commerce fulfillment and last mile. And there's a few unknowns which will drive what direction that moves. One of them will be gig economy and gig workers, so that the prevalence and the ease with which freelance drivers can provide that last mile in the moment. In the immediate term, I think it's going to make it much more prevalent to see instant delivery for just about any type of good. Over the long term, regulation may normalize that, but it's more likely to it'd be more of a cost and price adjustment, like many of us have maybe seen with Ubers in the last few months, than it would be a wholesale change of the operating model. So I expect it would continue.
Great, thank you. Tom, next question is for you. How are cross-border e-commerce trends reshaping shippers and 3PL fulfillment strategies and economics?
Thanks, Prob. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, right? So as we're seeing domestic e-commerce rise, we are also seeing substantial growth in cross-border e-commerce. And so the way that we define cross-border e-commerce is items that are fulfilled in one country that are shipped through the last mile into another country. So the example that I always use for folks is if you've bought an iPhone recently here in the States, you'll likely see that the shipping label that is attached to that iPhone comes all the way from the manufacturing facility in China. And so that item was stored and held in a different country. It was picked and then it was shipped via usually a parcel integrator, but not always, to a different country for final consumption. We're seeing quite a bit of growth, particularly in the trade where it's over land borders, right? So you can imagine places like in the United States and Canada, or the US, Canada, and Mexico, increasingly that occurring. Similarly in Europe, quite a bit of flow where obviously borders are a bit smaller there and parcel networks are more integrated. What we're seeing from this is actually an increasing opportunity to optimize the total cost across each of the different flows. So for items where storage is quite expensive, but they're quite value dense, so there's a lot of value in each dim weight package, you would expect those are going to have an increasing use of cross-border e-commerce, as they will be stored closer to their manufacture point in larger quantities and fewer locations, and then shipped via that last mile much longer than items that are bigger or less value dense. Similarly, as you think about different kind of mega geographies, you can imagine that folks are going to be positioning fulfillment in the cheapest locations. So our colleagues in Europe are quite familiar with a lot of fulfillment that occurs in Poland, and then items are shipped into further Western Europe because the fulfillment operation is so much cheaper to do there, and the transportation networks are so well integrated that they're able to do that at an appropriate and acceptable speed.
Great, thank you, Tom. Scott, another question for you. How big will locker structure be in the future? Do you believe it will increase a lot? And are there any big competitors with Amazon?
Thanks, Prob. It's an interesting question, and lockers have had quite a journey over the last, frankly, 5, 10, 15 years. The challenge lockers originally had, I believe, at least in the US, UPS and FedEx each toyed with this idea about 10, 15 years ago. And the challenge was high capital cost upfront, and still requiring customers to come to a location that was accessible 24 hours, but still protected so that the locker was not at risk for being damaged or at risk of vandalism. And so where lockers have found footing and been successful at scale was in fixed contained locations, like say when Amazon has a retail store, either manned or unmanned, having a locker available, or retail captive lockers where large box stores might have a locker for buy online, pick up in store at the front entrance that's accessible. I think the ceiling that would keep lockers from reaching the scale that maybe the larger players thought it could 10, 15 years ago is some emerging technology which will come in the future, whether it's unmanned vehicles or drones or whatever that future state might be, would be the at-scale answer for not having a shipper absorb the cost of that last mile of delivery.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Tom, next question goes to you. What are the tactics and strategies related to staff retention, acquisition, and development of capabilities?
Oh, that is probably the $6 million question for many of the folks that I think we're all interacting with, given where the world is today and how how much challenge we're seeing in the logistics space around attracting and retaining talent. There is no silver bullet to that. Unfortunately, I'd love to say that there's one simple trick that if you just do this, you're going to see massive retention and increase in attraction. But what I would say is that this timing of the question is perfect because McKinsey actually just published in our September McKinsey Quarterly an article called "Great Attrition or Great Attraction: The Choice is Yours" by Aaron DeSmet, Bonnie Dowling, Marino Magai, and Bill Scheringer. And I would encourage everybody to quickly Google that and give it a read. It has an interesting perspective around the factors that are driving more meaning in people's work, leading to more attraction and less attrition. So it's not just about dollars and cents. It's about creating, an environment with a sense of belonging, with understanding how people's individual work creates value for the customer and for the company overall, versus just seeing maybe their narrow part of the process and the value chain. It's about creating growth opportunities. We've seen a number of folks in the logistics space adding more development programs for folks where, for example, if you start in a warehouse, you can learn how to be a truck driver, which has benefits for both the individual who is learning a new trade that is often better paying, and for the client that is seeing increasing access to truck drivers because they're training folks and progressing them up themselves. So no one single bullet. Would encourage folks to take a look at that article and think holistically then about what's the career that you're offering folks, not just what's the job today.
Great, thank you, Tom. Scott, next question is for you. What would your reaction be to a retailer agnostic drive-through experience to alleviate pressure on the need for home delivery?
Yeah, the core of that question is another $6 million question, as Tom alluded to, and it's the idea of how do you get pull from consumers to come to the package and eliminate that need for home delivery in a world where that would have to be subscale driver doing that today. And there's a few examples of companies that are beginning to do this and exploring these opportunities. That the aggregators like FedEx and UPS have relationships now with pharmacies, Walmart, these companies that have a very distributed footprint. And we're seeing that it's quite successful in alleviating the need for some home deliveries, but it's not to the point where there's a meaningful shift or it's reducing the number of routes or stops significantly. But it is adding scale and it is adding value. So I'd imagine an enhanced experience of a retailer agnostic drive-through would perform incrementally better, but it wouldn't have the step change need on that results from consumers expecting something delivered to their doorstep at a higher and higher rate of speed. That need is the consumers are moving in that direction towards, I want it closer to where I want it, exactly when I want it, not further from that point.
Great, thank you, Scott. Tom, next one is for you. Do you think that traditional 3PL players are adapting to the new e-fulfillment reality fast enough, or are they losing ground, especially against large e-retailers like Amazon and potentially against emerging startups?
Yeah, that's a great question, Prab. Look, I think that it's tough because the cycle time is accelerating so fast, and when you include some of the big marketplaces and e-tailers, I think the challenge that traditional 3PLs have with that is the uncertain nature of the contract structure with the retailer that folks that have insourced this and vertically integrated don't have. So, for example, if you are a omni-channel retailer who is selling online and has massive fulfillment centers, it is much easier to make investments and capital commitments over time, because you are the captive provider to an intercompany relationship, versus the 3PLs having to make the decision around, geez, should I open a mega facility with only 10% of the capacity fulfilled today and then try to sell into that over the next year? Or should I do something much smaller and have 60% or 70% of the capacity already filled, but then less growth runway? That's a much harder trade-off, or much harder, financial equation that I think makes it difficult for 3PLs to move as quickly as those integrated players in the space. We think with the solutions or the steps that we recommended earlier today, folks can work to accelerate that cycle time and see more ability to invest on pace with the folks that they're trying to serve, and frankly, in some cases are competing against when they think about the potential to insource relative to hiring a contract logistics provider. And then on the startups, I go back to the point earlier around, to me, the real question there is, can they develop the maturity of their core logistics functions quicker than the traditional 3PLs can develop the simple, easy to onboard online solutions that the startups are better known for.
Great, thank you, Scott and Tom, and thank you to the audience for all of the questions you've submitted. We've received a few more questions that are quite specific in nature, so we'll be happy to follow up on those offline. But we really appreciate all of the questions that you've sent our way.
Thanks, everyone. Hope you've enjoyed the session, and our emails are here. Feel free to reach out anytime. Enjoy the rest of your day.